You have a seat. For those of you who are watching online, you're going to have to jump in quick in the comments because I'm going to open it up here live in the room. I'm going to ask a couple questions, and I'm curious just to see if you have these answers. There was this TV show back in the early 2010s. Actually, it kind of came to a close in the early 2010s. Ran in the early or mid to late 2000s. A guy by the name of Ty. He was a carpenter, remodeler, general contractor. Anybody remember his last name? Pennington, that's it, yeah. And he had a show called what? Extreme Makeover Home Edition. Is everybody on the same page? If you're online, just raise your hand. Don't raise your hand if you're online. I can't see you. But if you're in the room, raise your hand. Everybody know what I'm talking about? All right, great. This is important. This is foundational for today. Extreme Makeover Home Edition. And at the end of his extreme makeover, he would gather the family, and they would all be standing there, right? Whoever this was going to get this house, right? They would gather the family, and they would be standing there, and their friends would be there, and the entire neighborhood would be there, and there'd be all these construction people there, and all the people that worked in the house, and they'd be wearing matching T-shirts like they just got off a plane from a mission trip in some third world country, that kind of thing. Like they're all doing there, and they're all standing, and what would be in front of them? Anybody remember? A bus, right, a bus. And then when it came time for the big reveal, what did he ask him to say? Move. Whoa. Okay, this thing's been off the air for almost 8 years, okay? Clearly impactful. Move that bus. So Ty got upgraded, or I guess he got downgraded. The show got upgraded with Shiplap, that's the way it works, to, Chip and Joe, right? Anybody know the name of their show? Yeah, what a shame that thing got. What? Come on. I mean, they're just, man, I was addicted to it. I like Shiplap. It's a thing. It's good. Chip and Joe, at the end, you don't have to remember all these details. At the end, they would ask a very similar question. They wouldn't say move the bus, but, they have the big, maybe the big picture, right, of the old house. Right, and the fixer-upper, the way it looked before they did the fixer-upper, and the family would be standing in the street, and so they would have this big, huge picture of the way it used to be, and then Chip or Joe, one of the two of them would look at the family and say, hey, are you ready to see your fixer-upper? And of course, they're like, yes. And sure enough, they would pull it apart, and then all of a sudden, this drone footage would fly over the family and and man, it's showing the outside and showing the inside, and this slow, romantic music starts to play, and here they come, this family comes into the house, and they're watching the first reaction as they open the door, and there's just magically a camera already inside, but no one's inside, but there's just this magic camera. And they're watching these people walk in, and they're like, oh my goodness. And then they realize there's no TV on the walls. What are we going to do for TV? How are we going to watch the Braves? You know what I'm saying? There's no Braves. Well, actually, they're in Texas, right? They're in Waco, so they're probably Houston Astros fans. There's cheaters. They don't need to watch them people anyway. You know what I'm talking about? Anybody got a trash can to bang? You know what I'm saying? Okay, all right. Maybe I stepped over the line, but the truth hurts. It is what it is. Go Braves. Anyway, nevertheless, I'm sorry if I offended all of you who are watching from Houston. I don't think there's a bunch. But nevertheless, not anymore, they're not. They just turned it off. Where's Joel Osteen? That's what they're looking at. Oh, man, this is not good. I'm sorry. I need to reel this back in. I got to move on. Either way, you know what I'm saying. You feel me? That's what's happening. Here's the deal. Here's the question. Why does no one have a TV show that starts the day after the crew leaves? Why does nobody have a TV show? Nobody watches it. Nobody's interested? Like nobody wants to know how you cook eggs on your newly remodeled stovetop? No one's interested in that? It turns out the Apostle Paul, we refer to him as the church planter, Paul. He has an answer. I don't know if you picked up on it, but we've been in this series of talks called The Great Remodel. And we've been talking about what does it look like to have an honest-to-goodness remodel. And church planter Paul has some really good insight into what happens after the crews leave. Before we jump into it, let me make sure I catch everyone up if you're new to the talk. Paul is a church planter who plants churches everywhere. And there's this church that kind of is given birth to in the city of Rome. And he's never been to Rome to plant this church, and he's not sure who planted the church. Nobody knows how this whole church got started. There's some theories, but he doesn't have relationships with them. But he is the guy that's planting churches, and so he decides, you know what, I have a responsibility. I need to write a letter to this brand new church here in Rome, and I need to make sure I do a couple of things. And one of the things I need to make sure I do with this particular church in Rome is I need to make sure they understand the value of what they have discovered. And so they've discovered Jesus, the good news, and he says, I've got to make sure they understand the value of that. And so he spends 11 chapters in the book of Romans, the first 11 chapters in this letter, and it's all about, here's the value of what you have discovered. Here's the specifics behind just how incredible it is, the gospel of Jesus, the good news about salvation and the sin problem that all of us have, but the answer to that sin problem, how it's Jesus, and he's going to work it out in the world. And 11 chapters are spent on this whole idea, saying, hey, I want to make sure if you're going to do a remodel, step number one is this, first chapter 1 through 11, is you've got to understand the value of what you're working with. You've got to make a decision. Do I know about the bones in this house? Do I know what I'm working with? Do I know what I want to remodel? Do I understand the value here? And then he gets to chapter 12. And the very first 2 verses of chapter 12, he says, hey, here's what I want you to do. I want you to take a look, and I want you to offer your entire life because of how valuable it is what you found. There's an action step. Because of how valuable it is, I want you to offer your entire life as a living sacrifice. And this will be your spiritual act of worship. And then he goes so far to say, I want to make sure that you don't conform to the patterns or trends of this world, but I want you to be transformed by the remodeling or renewing of your mind. And then, if you're able to pull that off, you'll be able to find and follow the will of God. And so that's the remodel piece. He says, here's the deal. If you're going to do a remodel, you need to first understand the value of what you got. Second thing you've got to understand is you've got to purchase a dumpster. In other words, there's so much remodeling going to happen, you've got to make some space in your brain. And you've got to get rid of some of those things. So you've got to get a dumpster. And once that remodeling happens, I gave you a checklist last week. We discovered that, number one, the remodeling actually doesn't happen by our own hands, but it happens to us. And the checklist I gave you was, hey, here's 5 things that you can be doing to gather spiritual input in your life. And it's the spiritual input that does the remodeling, not ourselves. And in other words, you can go and read the Bible all day, but reading the Bible actually doesn't do any of the renewing or the remodeling. However, it's what you read, if you allow it actually to be a part of your life, that what you read, the content, the input, God's Spirit working through that content and input, that's what does the remodeling. It's not what we do with our own hands, it's what God does to us. And then we discovered that not only is it not something we do to ourselves, but is done to us, that it's an ongoing process, that it's not just a one and done, and now there's a remodel, here's a cool thing, move that bus, and that's all we get. That it's a constant, ongoing process. And so then we get to this next section of asking the question, so if we can understand the value of what we have, if we can have enough courage to hire someone to bring us a dumpster and actually throw a bunch of stuff away to make space, to receive spiritual input, to allow God to do the remodeling, what do we do when all the camera crews leave? After remodel has taken place, after it's started its process, then what do we do after that? So he's got a response. Romans chapter 12, the very next verse, verse 3, says this, "For by the grace given to me, I say to every one of you, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment, in accordance with the faith God has distributed to each of you. For by the grace given to me, I say to every one of you, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment, in accordance with the faith God has distributed to each of you." Now, verse 3 is the setup for verse 4, and we're not going to get to verse 4 just yet. And so, but you have to understand the setup. So we got to make sure we walk through this just briefly. The first thing we've got to kind of nail down on is he says, hey, it's by the grace given to me. In other words, he begins with, not only do I want you to understand the value of what you found, I want you to know that I understand the value of what I have found. He says, the reason that I can even speak to you about what I'm about to speak to you about is because I have been given grace. In fact, the authority that I have as an apostle, as someone who's leading the church, birthing churches in multiple cities, all over, multiple continents, the reason I can do that is not because anything that I have done myself, but because of what God has done through me. In fact, Paul has this incredible resume. In fact, there's another letter that he writes where he actually lists his resume. It's a pretty lengthy resume. And when it comes to being a Jewish man who wants to be a leader in a community, you would look at the resume that Paul lists and you would say, man, that's an incredible resume. It actually checks all the boxes in terms of faith and education and social standing and government standing, all those things. Like, it checks all of the boxes. And Paul actually says, here's the resume that I have done. These are the things that I have accomplished. This was done by my hands and my brain and my know-how, all of these things. I have accomplished these things. And you know what I consider this resume? Trash. I consider it trash. Compared to knowing Jesus and what Jesus has given me, what I've done with my own hands means nothing to me. And so Paul reminds them now, I've got some authority, but this authority doesn't come because of something that I have accomplished with these hands. It comes as a grace gift given to me, and I'm simply putting it to use. I heard that you had this church, and I want to make sure that you understand the value of what you found. And here's some action steps as a result of your remodeling project. He realizes his status, his influence, and his accomplishments are all a result of Jesus. I also love that Paul is talking to a group of believers that he's never met before. And so he uses that term. I don't know if you caught it or not. He says, by the grace given me, I say to every one of you. Right? So he's talking to a group of folks at a church he's never been to, that he's never met before. And he said, hey, and I'm telling every single one of you. Which means as they read it for the first time, and they have it read to them for the first time, they're listening to this church planter, this apostle, this guy with authority. They're listening to him, speak to him. And so we're in the same boat. Like, he's never met us either. And we are a church here in Noonan. And so when he's talking to us, man, this is written to us, a group just like us, but, 20 centuries ago. And now here we are. So he's talking specifically, here we go, coming to us. And then I don't know if you picked up on this, he uses the same word twice in this sentence. He uses the word think. He says, hey, I want you to do something. I want you to think. In other words, he said, we just spent verses 1 and 2 talking about what you need to do with your mind. I want you to renew it, to remodel it. I want you to be transformed because of what you do in your mind. I want it to transform your entire life. I don't want you to conform to the trends of the world, but I want you to be transformed by the spiritual input that you put in it and let God do the reworking and remodeling in your life. And so because of that, now that remodeling has started, it's an ongoing process. It never stops. It's being done to us, so it's not on our own. Now I want you to use that remodeled mind to think, and I want you to do it 2 ways, he says. The first is a negative. The second is a positive. The first one, he says, I want you to think this way. Do not think of yourselves more highly than you ought. Do not think of yourselves more highly than you ought to. In other words, it's an encouragement towards humility. What Paul has found is that incredible resume that he built. One of the reasons he can look at that resume and say, yeah, this is worth nothing to me, is because he realizes the enormity of Jesus in his life, and that has humbled him. Where he used to be able to stand on his accolades and what he accomplished, he now stands in the shadow of Jesus, and that shadow is grace that covers him and gives him the opportunity to speak into the lives of other believers. And he says, and I feel incredibly comfortable standing in the shadow of Jesus. I don't need a spotlight anymore. I'll just continue to ride his coattails from city to city, church to church, believer to believer, unbeliever to believer, letting people know the value of what I found. And so he wants to encourage every single one of us, after the remodel happens, would you take a posture of humility? You see, what happens sometimes is we go into a neighborhood and we kind of remodel this one particular house, right? They'll go into a neighborhood and every other neighborhood or every other house hasn't been remodeled, and there's just one house, and all of a sudden there's this bright shining star. And this bright shining star sometimes can come out of that remodel process, that move, that bust moment, and they can think, man, we got the best house on the block now. You know what I'm saying? Oh, look at us. Come on. We got the best house on the block now. And Paul's just saying, hey, I'm just warning you. You've got this incredible remodel that's happened. But you need to be incredibly careful with your attitude about the remodel that's happened, because if you're not, you will just turn yourself into an incredibly religious person who just looks at everyone else like, don't you wish you got remodeled? Look how remodeled I am. And so he says, hey, don't forget, the remodeling isn't done by your hands. It's done to you. So when you take a look at your remodeled self, don't begin to lord it over other folks that haven't been remodeled. Don't become this religious snob that says, hey, look at me. You should be like me. Hey, look at this. Look what I have done. Hey, look at all the things that I'm accomplishing in the name of fill in the blank. Let's take all of these pictures about what I want to do, right? He said, I need to warn you ahead of time, because this is the deal. When you get remodeled, there's just this thing that happens like, hey, this is nice and shiny and fancy, and I want to show it off. So he says, hey, could I bring you back to earth for a second? In fact, he uses this call to humility as a call to come back towards the character of Jesus. As I'm trying to introduce to you how to live a life that's been remodeled, that's had the basement, the courage and the commitment to say, man, not the basement, the dumpster, that say, hey, man, I got so much stuff I got to put in there, right? And I got so much stuff to get rid of. But I understand the value of what I found in Jesus, and so it's worth it to get the dumpster. It's worth it to make the space for the remodel. And once I understand the worth of all these things, I don't want to go back towards a mindset that's not right. I want to stay in a mindset of remodel, which is the mindset of Jesus. I think if you define Jesus with just two words, it'd be love and humility. And he says, could I remind you of this humility? I think when we're humble, it also keeps us grateful. In addition to us living in our humility, that the remodel is not something we accomplished ourselves, but was accomplished in us on behalf of Jesus and the work of the Spirit of God. Then in addition to that, it allows us to be incredibly grateful. It allows us to have some integrity when things don't go right in our lives, to say it is well. And I can be grateful in it is well moments, because I know that it is well, these low moments in my life are not the summation or the generalization or the way that's typically, it's not the norm for who I am. But I can be grateful in low moments because I was grateful in normal moments and high moments. And in fact, it's the low moments that make me even more grateful and more humbled to say, you know what, I've got some really great days behind me and surely ahead of me. And so in this moment, when things aren't the way that they're supposed to be, I'm going to be so grateful for my past and my future, while at the same time saying, hey, here it is. This is just going to make me even more grateful for the things that have yet to come. He says, could I just remind you of a little humility, to be a little grateful? And so that was the first way he uses the word think. The second one was more positive. He says, what I do want you to do, I don't want you to think more highly of yourselves. I do want you to think of yourself with sober judgment in accordance with the faith God has distributed to each of you. I want you to think of yourself clearly, objectively, reality-based assessment on your faith. Not an emotional response, because emotional responses sometimes can get us in a whole lot of trouble. But could you just take a look? Where are you truly at in your walk with Jesus? Allow that to be your baseline. And that sets us up for what he actually wants us to do. That's the setup. Verse 3 is the setup, and verse 4 actually gets into, and this is what I want you to do. With humility and gratefulness. With sober thinking. Objectively looking at your life. Here's what I want you to do. Verse 4. For just as each of us has one body with many members, and these members do not have all the same function, so in Christ we, though many, form one body, and each member belongs to all the others. We have different gifts according to the grace given to each of us. If your gift is prophesying, then prophesy in accordance with your faith. If it's serving, then serve. If it's teaching, then teach. If it's to encourage, then give encouragement. If it's giving, then give generously. If it's to lead, do it diligently. If it's to show mercy, do it cheerfully. He says, hey, this entire remodel, understanding the value of what we have, having the courage to get the dumpster, get rid of the stuff you don't want, make space for the spiritual input, to remodel. The whole purpose behind that. Take the humility and the gratefulness for the new space that you've been given, the new move that bus moment, and then begin to put it to work. He says, whatever your gift is. Did you see some of those gifts? It was teaching, giving, serving, encouraging, showing mercy, right? There's a number of things. Just ran down the list real quick. That wasn't an exhaustive list of, hey, here's all the gifts. You got to follow one of these. It's just a list of, hey, here's a few things. If this happens to be it, this is what I want you to do with it. It's this moment of not only do we get a remodeled mind, there's gifts to go with it. It's like you say, yeah, I'm ready to see my fixer-upper. It's move that bus, and then you see it. And it's like, man, this is incredible. This looks great. And then all of a sudden you walk into the house, and it's like, oh, you did the inside too, right? Oh, there's all kind of stuff, and there's stuff you can use. You know what I'm saying? Like my favorites were when they did themes in the kids' bedrooms. You know what I'm talking about? Like they were like, oh, I like tree frogs. And all of a sudden it was the Amazon rainforest in the entire bedroom. You know what I'm talking about? Like those kind of moments. That's what these gifts are. It's, hey, not only going to remodel the mind space, I went on top of that, I'm going to give you some gifts specifically to use to make a difference in the world, and I want you to use those. I want you to use them, is what he's saying. The question is, where do these gifts come from? Like, how do we get this tree frog room? The Spirit of God brings them into our lives and awakens them for a purpose. The Spirit of God places us on a team. Team Jesus. And every single one of us has a role to play on Team Jesus. You remember, I don't know, maybe some of you grew up the same time I did. Probably all of you grew up the same time I did, or before me, which means this applies to probably most people in the room. It used to be a thing in PE where you play kickball or dodgeball. You know what I'm talking about? Kickball, you just love the moment, especially in dodgeball, where you could just take a ball and just knock the snot out of someone with it. You know what I'm talking about? Before we got the softballs, we were actually using kickballs for actual dodgeball. And I mean, if you could throw it hard enough, you could knock someone off their feet. You know what I'm talking about? Like that kind of thing. Like they think they're slick and they're going to come up to the line and you're like, oh no, I got it. And it's the full roundhouse. You know what I'm talking about? That kind of thing. Or in kickball, you probably remember, there was always a moment where the kids would start picking teams, and there's always someone picked last. I don't think they allow people to pick teams anymore. They just cut them in half and say you go left, you go right, and then you just got to play. But it used to, you pick people, and someone had to get picked last, right? Somebody got picked last. And the person picked last, just be honest, the person picked last, when you're picking them, you're like, okay, yeah, I'll take them. And then you just go over to them like, hey, here's the deal. Just stand at the back. Just stand at the back. Just stand there. I just stay out of my way at the end of the day because I'm about to cover this whole kickball field, okay? I got skills and they're multiplying, you know what I'm saying? And so you just stay in the back, right? And then when it's their turn to kick, you're trying to arrange, I don't know, like you're pretending you're going to kick if you're the big kicker, and all of a sudden they kick and everybody's moved back and they a little duel. You know what I'm talking about? A little fake. Anyway, that's what's happening. So in this particular time, when we talk about Team Jesus, sometimes maybe in our mind, for those of you who are not, hey, I'm a big team sports guy, maybe in your mind you're like, that's the last thing I want to be a part of is some kind of sports team with Jesus. Because I don't want to be the last again. We talk a lot here at Foundation about puzzle pieces. My grandmother loved to do puzzles. And she was in a generation that had dining rooms. I don't know if y'all remember those, but there was like a separate room that no one ever went in except for holidays. And it had a whole other table in there and fancy things. But she would clear off her dining room table and she would start these puzzles. And these puzzles were enormous. Thousands of pieces of puzzles. And sometimes they would be so large, it would take her weeks to do them. I'd go over there and she'd have a little piece and I'd come back the next week and she'd get further and take 2 or 3 weeks. And here's the deal. When you get done with like an 8,000 piece puzzle, it's enormous. When you get done with the 8,000-piece puzzle, and you've got 7,999 pieces, but the one piece, like your great-grandchild took off the table and ate it, and it ended up in their diaper 2 days later, you know what I'm talking like at that moment, you're looking at this complete work of art that's incomplete. And she'd give anything at that moment for that one last piece. It's almost like the last piece matters just as much as the first piece. And that's what it's like to be a part of Team Jesus. In fact, some might say the last piece is the piece that pulls it all together. And so, if you're watching today or sitting here in person, and you haven't figured out where you fit on the team, and you're thinking to yourself, well, it's because nobody wants me on the team, you'd be wrong. You see, the kingdom of God doesn't work like kickball or dodgeball. The kingdom of God works like puzzles. And every single person matters. Paul is trying to say, there's no role where you just go stand in the back and stay out of the way. He's saying that in your life, the value, chapter 1 through 11, is equal to mine as church planter. He said, I'm the apostle, and the value I have for Jesus is the same value you have for Jesus. And the gifts that God has given you or wants to give you will be equally valued to the gifts that God has given me. And I'm simply using my gifts right now and encouraging you to do the same, is what Paul's saying. He said every single person has a place. And every single person ought to engage and jump in. No matter what the world has told you, you have a role to play. You know, people come and chat with me all the time, and they ask this question. Or maybe it's not framed as a question, it's more of a statement. They say, I want to do something that matters. I feel like my life just doesn't have a purpose. Like I work, and I got a house, and I pay the rent, or pay the mortgage, and I got a car, and we go through the motions, but there's got to be something more than just what I'm doing, this cycle of things. There's got to be something more. Like, I want to have purpose. How do I have purpose? How do I do something that means something more than just the tiny little world that I'm living in at the moment? How can I become a part of something bigger than myself, bigger than just me? And how can I contribute to something that matters and moves the needle and moves people and moves the thought process of our community forward? I think that's step one, is you just got to be willing to have a conversation and say, I'm the puzzle piece that fell on the floor. I'm just the puzzle piece that's just right under the leg of that kitchen table or dining room table. And I'm flipped upside down and the carpet's brown and my back is brown, so we blend in together, but I'm on the floor. Please pick me up. Please put me on the table. Put me in the puzzle. You just got to start there. When we have that conversation, I tell people, look, you can't be intimidated by the discovery process. It takes some time. Some folks are a little easier, right? The edge pieces, that's how I start a puzzle. I take the edge pieces, I put them around the side. Like, that's easy. I know where those edge pieces go. Not everyone's an edge piece, though, right? And even though the edge piece, they might not be in the perfect place, but they're in the ish place. I mean, somewhere around here. But some folks, man, it just takes a little more time. You can't be afraid of the discovery process. Embrace it. Say, hey, here's the deal. Let's start with two basic questions. What's available? What's available for me to jump in and just try and see if this awakens something in me, if this gets me excited about having some other way to contribute? The next question is, maybe it's not what's needed. Maybe what's needed? You remember. Because sometimes what's needed, you remember. Sometimes what's needed is it's not where all the action's happening. Sometimes it's back home in your dad's trophy room. Right? You remember what I'm talking about. It's 1993. This movie came out, it depicted this group of boys. They're playing baseball, and this kid named Smalls was standing out of the way. And he was way in the back, and Porter was up. Porter's the catcher. He wasn't catching now, though, because he was hitting. And so he was ready to go. He was all kind of thing, this curly-haired, red-headed, freckled guy. And he called a shot like the Babe. You know what I'm talking about? For those of you who are completely lost, I'm talking about the Sandlot, okay? If you're going to be really lost in the next 6 minutes, if you haven't never seen the movie, you'll have to pick that up later, but I'm not going to change my illustration. Here we go. So Porter's standing there, and he's calling a shot, and then all of a sudden, pitch comes, and there it goes. And people are admiring it, and he's like, yeah, it's gone. So he begins to flop around first base, and people are throwing their gloves at him, and he's getting hit, and he's like, hit it over the fence, hit it, all those things. And people, they're so upset with him because he just lost their only ball because they hit it into the cage, the yard with the beast. And any ball that goes in with the beast never comes out, right? And so they're so upset with him. They're like, man, we don't have a ball. We don't have a ball. And so, man, they're throwing stuff at him, and he's doing it. And then Smalls in the back, and he's like, I've got a ball. And I'm like, you have a ball? He's like, yeah. They're like, well, go get it. And so he runs home, and he goes into his dad's trophy room, and he takes the ball, and he runs back, and he throws it in. They're like, hey, your ball, you get to hit. And he's like, okay, cool. So Smalls gets up there, and he's like, oh, here we go. And strike one. And this kid's never played before. He's for sure picked last. You know what I'm talking about? And then all of a sudden, just out of nowhere, this luck happened, and ball meets bat, and ball goes flying, and it goes over the fence, and the same thing, except this time, they're excited about it. They're like, yeah, Smalls, that's incredible. Because this guy never hit a ball in his life, like the whole time. It's like, you can't even hit broadside of a barn. Just stand in the back. They're pumped. And they're celebrating. And Smalls is not celebrating. In fact, Smalls gets around first base, and he just starts staring and walking into the outfield. And they're like, hey, kid, we know you've never run the bases, but third's that way. You got to turn. He's like, I got to get that ball back. And they're like, no. Remember the first ball, the whole reason we got the ball is balls don't come back from the beast. He's like, well, that's not my ball. I'm like, well, whose ball is it? He's like, it's my dad's ball. I'm like, well, we'll get him another ball. He's like, no, this ball's important to him. Why is it so important to him? He's like, well, it was signed by some lady, Like, some lady? He's like, yeah, Baby Ruthie. They're like, Babe Ruth? The Sultan of Swat? The Colossus of Clout? All those things? Some of you just want to take your remodeled life, keep it in a trophy room. Because it looks nice. Sure looks nice sitting there. Some of you want to take your gift, put it on a display case, and say, yeah, look at that. When you bring guests over for dinner, you just say, hey, come into this trophy room. Let me show you all this stuff I don't use. But it looks real nice. I'll show you this. Smalls was in so much trouble. So much trouble. You know how Smalls describes that summer of his life? In the movie, he says, it was the greatest summer of my life. When he decided to take what was supposed to be on display in a trophy room and put it in the game. How about you? Because the truth is, if you're a follower of Jesus, God has given you something incredibly special, and you get to choose. Put it on display or put it in the game. Put it on display or put it in the game. Paul is writing to this baby church, pleading, begging with them, don't build a trophy room. put it in the game. And every single one of you have to make that decision for yourself. Every single one of you. I think it's important when you lay your head on your pillow at night with your remodeled life that you are completely exhausted. I think it's important that every single day when you go to sleep in the evening that you can look up at the stars or through your drywall and floor and say, hey, here's the deal, God. I gave it my all today. I'm wore slap out because I put it in the game. That I leveraged what you've given me and what I have on display. And I said, you know what? No more displaying this, but I'm putting it to work. I'm putting it to work on behalf of the team that I'm on. Because I don't just hang in the back and just watch and just kind of pretend and try not to get in the way. No, I'm involved in the game. I'm involved in the process. I'm getting after it. I'm wore out. I'm not like new furniture or new carpet that was put in the house. We're saying, hey, we're not going to eat on that from now on. I know we used to eat in the living room. We've got new carpet in the living room, so we're not going to eat in there. How long does that last, right? Eventually you say, you know what? No, the reason we have a house is not to look at it, but to live in it. And the reason Jesus wants to remodel your life is not for you to stare at it in the mirror, but for you to get stains all over it. Because if you remember, the thing we learned about remodeling is it's done to us. And it's a constant process, which means we are remodeled day after day after day after day. So stain it up, tear it up, wear it out. Because God can just make it new again. Stain it up. Tear it up, wear it out, because God will make it new again. That choice is yours. You were given a gift. Take it out of the trophy room. Take it off the display case. Put it in the game.